Perfect. Um, Pray to the technology gods for me because sometimes Zoom doesn't like my downloaded videos. But um, can you folks hear?
The federal government of Canada recently passed Bill C-16, which includes gender identity and gender expression in our Human Rights Act. But what does Bill C-16 mean for folks living in Canada? C-16 amends the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code to include gender identity and gender expression as grounds protected from discrimination, in the same way they protect grounds like race, religion, age, and sexual orientation. Now, this may have you asking, what exactly are gender identity and gender expression, and why do they need to be protected? We all have a gender identity, that internal experience of being a man, woman, both, or neither. And all people express gender in unique ways, through their clothing, hairstyle, voice, and behavior. When a baby is born, people are quick to ask, is it a boy or a girl? But it's not always that simple. As we grow, some people realize they don't identify fully, or in part, with what people expect about the sex assigned to them at birth. And for some, this might mean they identify as transgender or trans. This is the T that you might recognize from the acronym LGBTQ. And trans can be an umbrella term used to represent a wide range of identities and experiences. And though there is more public awareness and visibility of trans lives than ever before, data reveals distressing levels of anti-trans discrimination, harassment, and violence. In an Ontario survey of trans people, 18% were turned down for a job, 20% were physically or sexually assaulted, and 34% were verbally threatened or harassed, all because of their gender identity. So Bill C-16 protects us from being discriminated against because of how we identify or express our gender in areas like immigration, criminal law, federal services, and the census. It also makes spreading hate propaganda based on gender identity and gender expression a criminal offense, which helps protect our trans and gender diverse communities. And while achievements at the federal level are important advancements for human rights, similar protections are lacking across Canada's provinces and territories. Despite Bill C-16, some provinces and territories are still in the process of amending their human rights protections to include gender identity and gender expression. And not all provinces and territories explicitly protect gender expression. And this leaves serious gaps for discrimination on these grounds in the healthcare, education, and justice systems, because these systems are governed by provincial and territorial human rights law. So Bill C-16 is not enough. Provinces and territories must measure up to the federal government's action. Make gender identity and gender expression protected grounds throughout Canada.
That is a lovely little video from Egal Canada, which in my little follow-up email for you folks, I'll send a link to because I find it is a helpful one to have. It goes over quite a range of stuff, I think, in a really clear way. The really important part about Bill C-16 being it added gender identity and expression to our federal human rights code. And as you can see on my slide here, in New Brunswick, our Human Rights Commission has also updated to include gender identity and expression. There's a few things I like to chat about around this and why I really like to start around the human rights codes. I think one is just remembering that it is something that is protected. And for a lot of folks, there was quite a stress to not have gender identity and expression protected by our Human Rights Code until 2016, which really isn't quite that long ago. And thinking about what gender expression is itself, which we'll get more into as we go along, but it's kind of how you show how you feel on the inside on your outside. It's those kindergarten rule kind of things that don't hurt anyone at the end of the day. And I think for myself, growing up, I like to say I've worked every customer service job that the city has to offer. But for me, until 2016, if I wanted, the male uniform so I could have longer sleeves to feel more comfortable, that wasn't necessarily something that was allowed. It would depend on if I had a nice manager or if, nobody noticed which one I checked off on the order form. And it's something that simple that can help someone feel like they can really show up and do, what they're there to do at the end of the day. That is really important. The other thing I think is important thinking about, that sexual orientation, that gender identity and expression are all protected traits. I think that sometimes we can get lost in thinking we need to understand every nuance and every term before showing that respect to the person in front of us. And I think as we go through a few different tips and tricks and tools to have in your toolkit, you'll see at the end of the day, it's really not about knowing every single thing. It's more so about being willing to listen to the person in front of you and being vulnerable enough and willing enough to make some changes, even if they're breaking some of these stereotypes and some of these habits and some of these connections in our brain that we already have and have to retrain. And my more joking way of saying that is, I don't understand how a plane works, and quite frankly, they're too heavy to be in the air. But if someone gave me a ticket to go on vacation right now, especially with this icy weather, I'd get on that plane, And I think we can do the same things, thinking of our fellow humans at the end of the day, just to make people feel like they can really show up and they can really be there. That, and my last kind of rant on our human rights commission here, is just also remembering, provincially especially, what kinds of things the government controls. Things like healthcare, things like education, places where in order to really get the service you need to be able to show up with a degree of vulnerability. If you're worried about hiding pieces of yourself and protecting pieces of yourself, it's going to be a lot harder to sit down and learn math at the end of the day. So that's why this is really important, and that's why it's important, I think, to root ourselves in this, to remember we're just trying to make it so, to put it really simply, people feel like they can show up to the math class and learn. So people feel like they can go and do the job they're being paid for, so people can just live. Awesome. So we're going to jump into some terms and definitions. If there's any questions, feel free to throw up a hand or interrupt me. I like to say this is kind of a choose your own adventure. It's not so much about getting through all the slides. It's more so about having the conversation and giving you folks the information that is going to be most helpful for you. So first, I like to start out with what is an ally, a term a lot of us have probably heard before, but what is it in the lens of the rainbow community? So it's someone who does not identify as 2SLGBTQIA+, but who is supportive. And that support isn't enough to just kind of, say you are supportive. You really kind of have to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak, and take some action and make sure you support gender equality, civil rights, social movements, and challenge homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. And I think this is, better thought about, thinking about the term ally itself as kind of that journey versus an identity or a label, because it really is in many ways more of that long-term growing process. And I think it's even easier thought about when we break it down into the 4 A's kind of allyship. So right at the top, we have our first A, awareness. So there's a problem, you see something happening, you can tell something's not quite right here. You've got your second A, analysis. You kind of triage what's going on, so to speak, and figure out what's happening specifically. Is someone, using a wrong name, a wrong pronoun, just being blatantly rude? What is the actual situation happening? The third A, acting. So that's the putting your money where your mouth is kind of step. And it doesn't need to be an action that is grandiose or huge, but really making sure to make that clear line for someone is really important. So I think of things like simply, hey, they go by this pronoun. Whoa, this is their name. Or even, whoa, we don't speak like that here. Just drawing that clear line is really, really important. And then the last A, and the one I do think is the most important, accountability. Reflecting, continuing to learn, and being willing to adjust what you do based on new and good information. We're human, we're constantly learning. And I think, even outside of the lens of what we're doing today, we all want to grow and be better tomorrow and next week and next month and next year than we are right now. And it's important that we treat allyship in all its realms in the same way as something that grows and changes and just helps us be better humans at the end of the day to the folks in our circles. Perfect. So we've got our rainbow acronym 2SLGBTQIA plus. There are lots of different versions you could see out there. 2SLGBTQ plus, LGBTQ plus are two other really common ones you could see. This is one of the more inclusive ones that you will see, which I recommend to use in formal writing where applicable, and great to teach because it is very helpful to go through a lot of the different identities and terms that folks may have heard. So one thing I'm going to do is kind of jump through all the identities or all the letters of the acronym here real quick, and then go back over them in a little bit more detail. So with our 2S, we have 2-spirit, L, lesbian, G, gay, B, bisexual, and we'll talk about the term pansexual as well. T, transgender, and we have non-binary genders. The Q can stand for queer or questioning. We've got our I, intersex, A, asexual, and then we've got our plus sign for many more. The English language and many languages are constantly evolving. We love to add new words and terms overall as a language. And there's a real power in being able to describe yourself to someone else or describe how you're feeling to someone else. So if you find a nuanced term that you feel really describes your sexuality or your gender to someone else, and it's not on this list I'm showing today, it does not mean you are not part of the queer plus or the trans plus community. It's just that sake of language and what that plus sign is really trying to add in there. So we're going to start here with two-spirit. Two-spirit is a term that is specific to Indigenous communities. One really important part about the term two-spirit is while the English word two-spirit is a newer term, the concept behind two-spirit people is something that is thousands of years old. And it can mean something slightly nuanced depending on the individual and the community they come from, sorry. But at its base, it generally means someone who possesses both masculine and feminine energies and recognizes them both. Again, the really important part being that it is specific to Indigenous communities. And I think one of the things to think about too around that and around two-spirit individuals having been here for a very, very long time is a lot of the time it feels like we're moving to these new ideas and concepts around gender and sexuality. And I think in a lot of ways, we're kind of moving back to the freedom of being openly human that was there before kind of these social constructs and colonization happened. We've got our L, lesbian. So traditionally women who are attracted or date other women. Gay first started out as a term that meant men attracted to other men, but it's really evolved into an umbrella term for people who are attracted to the same sex. Pardon me. We've got the term bisexual. So thinking of the prefix bisexual first came about as someone who was attracted to two genders. Thinking of some of our more stringent social views on gender that weren't traditionally so open, that term came about more thinking about folks who were attracted to men and women. It's really evolved though to someone who's attracted to two or multiple genders. I think depending on the individual, it can mean something slightly different. But with that prefix bi traditionally meaning, too, there was a want for a term that meant attraction to kind of more genders, just thinking of how gender is more expansive than that. And we'll go a bit more into that in the following slides too. So pansexual just means someone who's attracted to multiple genders. We've got our T for transgender, and we're going to go over this a lot more again in the following slides. But at its base, someone who is transgender, their gender identity, and that's your inside concept of yourself, doesn't match up with your sex assigned at birth. And what I mean by sex assigned at birth, when you're born and the doctor looks at you and based on their best guess of physical anatomy, say it's a boy or it's a girl, that would be what I mean by sex assigned at birth. And we're going to talk about some non-binary genders as well within more of our talk around transgender folks, just thinking about, we have our binary genders of male and female. Non-binary genders would be anything in between or outside of those two definitions. Then we've got our Q, which has two different words that are associated with it. The first one being queer. It's really important to recognize the history around the word queer. It was used as a slur towards the community for a long time and has really come to be reclaimed a lot, I would say, especially in the last 15 years or so. I think part of that has to do with the openness of the word queer. It can be applied to both gender and sexuality, essentially just meaning, not straight or gender diverse in some way. I like to say it keeps a little bit of mystery as a little bit of a joke, but I think part of the attraction to that is for a long time there was a little bit of a sense if you couldn't figure out exactly which letter you were on the acronym, or where you fit in, that you weren't necessarily a part of the community. And I think it's really important that, we're not making folks, no matter who they are, fill out checklists to feel like they are enough in any way, not just in this kind of realm. So making sure, again, we're moving back towards that openness of how we need to show up. And that's part of why the Q also stands for questioning. Because again, thinking it's okay if you don't know exactly what terms to use to describe your sexuality or your gender or how you feel at this given time. Or if none of these words really identify with you, it doesn't mean that you don't feel the way you feel or you don't love the people you do or don't want to express yourself the way you do. So just important to kind of be intentional around that. I think just thinking about some of the history behind the community. We've got our I for intersex. So many different aspects of being a human are on a scale versus a binary or black and white kind of system. Sexuality isn't black and white. It's not gay or straight. There are sexualities in between and outside. Gender, also not black and white. It's not just male or female. We've got our non-binary genders, again, in between or outside of that. And all these things become a little bit less surprising when we look deeper into things like even biological sex. So biological sex isn't quite as black and white as we've traditionally thought. So depending on your chromosomes, your hormone levels, your presentation of physical anatomy, you can actually fall in between biologically male and female. It's more common than folks think too. The statistic approaches similar to people who have naturally red hair. And it's not always recognized until later in life too. But I think just important to note that even in a lot of the aspects, we do think people are one way or the other, or it has to be this or that. That's not so true as we look deeper and deeper into it. We really do exist on these sliding scales and continuums that we all have a little bit of a spot on and a little bit of a difference. So I think that's just a really important part to really pull that all together. And then we've got our A for asexual. So we experience a couple different types of attractions. So we've got our physical attraction, and that would be that more I want to hug and kiss you kind of attraction versus emotional attraction, which is that more I want to, share that brain space or energy with you kind of attraction. And for folks who are asexual, they experience to some lesser degree that physical kind of attraction. And I know that was a lot all at once, and I will assure you there's no quiz. But does anyone have any burning questions before we keep going on here? Yeah, Tom.
Uh, what's the difference between intersex and non-binary?
Yeah, so intersex is about biological sex. So this would be about your chromosomes, your hormone levels, um, all that kind of stuff, versus someone who is non-binary is about their gender. So that's your inside concept of yourself. That's your gender identity, and that's not tied to that biological piece. Does that make sense?
I'll have to think about it. Thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Perfect. I just keep pressing the wrong button to move the slides. Oh, and I'm actually going to skip past that one and send you that video for sake of time, because I really like to gab and I always add more slides than I should. But that's a really nice video from Gage Purley of the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance, just giving a little bit more context on Two-Spirit allyship. And just some more information there. And again, just emphasizing that point that different genders and different people have been around for a really, really long time. And this is a screenshot of a map from pbs.org. If you Google Two-Spirit map, it is the first result that comes up. Thank you, PBS. But it's really cool because it shows you different examples of gender across the world and how even in that, there's a lot of differences. So it's not quite as stringent as we've thought. And sometimes to expand ourselves even beyond our own culture is something that I find really helpful. And one thing I'll say on this as well, and I'll say a couple more times here before we leave each other. You may be shocked to find out this afternoon is not the be all and end all of allyship and inclusion, and more so a challenge to really start that journey and continue on that journey. And it's about figuring out for yourself, based on your own comfort and knowledge, what are those steps you can take over that next year, month, whatever it may be, and taking some time to look at this map or this kind of information can be one of those things you make that commitment to just kind of continue on that journey. Awesome. We're gonna whip through a few more definitions here. I'll try not to completely overwhelm you. Some of them we went over on the last couple of slides because I get too excited. Again, there's no quiz. It's just to add a little bit of more familiarity behind these words that maybe we've heard but don't completely understand what they may mean. So first, we've got the term cisgender. Someone who is cisgender, their gender identity or inside concept of themselves matches up with their sex assigned at birth. Versus transgender, which we did go over on the other side, but on the other slide, sorry, but again, is someone whose gender identity doesn't match up with their sex assigned at birth. In the middle of those two definitions, there I have AMAB and AFAB. That just stands for assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth. Just a really good way to refer to, that moment, that sex assigned at birth, without putting an identity on someone that maybe they've never had or they don't experience. I think a really important part thinking about sex assigned at birth is that outside of specific healthcare or other very specific situations, there isn't really a reason to be asking for someone's sex assigned at birth. I think it's important to think about what you're really asking someone. If you're asking someone that, you're asking them kind of what's in their pants, which I think in most situations is a weird question to ask. And I know a bit silly to say, but I do like to kind of really go to my way on that one because I think sometimes, and I don't think it's always um, with any sort of malice, but I think our curiosities can get the better of us, and we ask for a little bit more information than we need sometimes, even with the best intention. But I think important to kind of frame where we are and what we're actually asking for, and if we need to make sure again we're building that place where people are comfortable showing up. And if people are being asked all these kind of questions that would likely make ourselves a bit uncomfortable, then it's no wonder that maybe they wouldn't feel fully able to be there. Perfect. We went over intersex on the last slide as well. Again, that has to do with biological sex. So we're thinking hormone levels, chromosomes, we're thinking our physical anatomy. The term queer we went over again, but important to just really emphasize the history around the word. And just to give my piece of advice around even using the word queer, is I would never label an individual themselves as queer unless they self-identified as queer. I think that's a really good way to kind of have an automatic check-in with someone. That being said, there could be moments where you're having a conversation with a group of people and someone may be like, oh, I don't like that word. And that's when you can pull some other things out of your toolkit, whether it be, the rainbow community, the 2SLGBTQIA plus community. There's a couple other different things you can use. Again, it's not about having it perfect the first time, every time. It's about being willing and open to listen and being willing to adjust are the hugest things. Questioning, we already went over. Dead name is one that I think is important to go over, just thinking about for some folks who transition, a name change is a part of that. And I think we all know to some degree, updating your license on the best of days can be a bit of a headache, let alone if you've got to go through a bit of another process along with that, with some documentation. So there can be some time where the name someone's using doesn't match up with what's on that ID. And there are situations where you do need to show your ID to receive some services. Unfortunately, even among friends I know, there's a lot of cases where as soon as you show that legal ID, folks will flip back to that name versus what you've already introduced yourself as. And I think that's one of those, again, simple kind of kindergarten rules where, just calling someone by the name they've asked to be called is one of those simple things you can do to help them show up. That being said, again, there's certainly times where you need that legal name or you need to use that ID. So just having, a term for it like dead name, where I find even on Forbes or things, or people who distinguish that you do need that legal name, but making sure to really listen to the person in front of you to address them still is the important part there. And that was another little block of information. Does anyone have any questions, comments, or concerns before we keep trucking through here? Perfect. Again, always feel free to interrupt if there is anything. The hour sessions always go so much faster than I think they're going to. This is my transgender umbrella, and I really, really like it because a lot of the times when we think about folks who are transgender, we often just think of that left-hand side or that binary side of the umbrella, trans men and trans women. But even at a quick glance, we can see, oh, there's a lot of different kind of ways to be transgender, to be gender diverse that maybe we haven't heard of before, haven't thought about. And there's not going to be a quiz on this. So don't panic. The important part of this diagram is just taking a moment to realize that being transgender, much like many other labels or identities that we have or share with people, is more expansive than than kind of closing us in, and important to kind of reframe and remember that. I am going to jump through some of these identities so we are a little bit familiar with them, but don't feel the need to completely memorize everything here. So first we have the term gender queer, thinking about how we talked about the term queer being that open kind of umbrella term. It means someone who is gender diverse in some way. It's super, super open. Again, I like the joke. It leaves a little bit of mystery, but it really is that really, really open term. We have demi-boy and demi-girl, which are two terms that are similar to trans-masculine and trans-feminine. So someone who identifies to some degree with masculinity or femininity, but not to the extent they consider themselves kind of a binary trans man or woman. We have neutros, and thinking about that prefix, that kind of neut prefix, it means a more neutral gender. Agender, someone who doesn't identify with gender as we have it defined in our culture. Bigender, thinking of that prefix bi, meaning someone who identifies with two or multiple genders. And then gender fluid, so that is someone whose gender identity and expression can fluctuate depending on their sense of self that day. And then we've got that and more at the bottom, which is just like that plus sign on our acronym, which again just goes to say, if you find that term that really helps yourself explain your gender identity to someone else, but it's not under this umbrella, it doesn't mean you're not transgender, you're not non-binary, or you're not gender diverse. And just again, really, really important to remember that, even though we may be unfamiliar with some terms or some words or some language, that's not what we're going to be quote unquote tested on at the end of the day. It's how well you can listen to the person in front of you and really take them as the best expert of themselves, despite again some of these stereotypes and scripts that have really been drilled into our head for a long time through media and through just life at large. Awesome. I want to ask a really quick question here, and feel free to throw in the chat or just yell out at your will. But can anyone think of one historical figure that was lesbian, gay, or bisexual?
Does Ellen DeGeneres count as historical, or we're looking like more historical, like more?
Probably more historical. I figure if someone's still around to get offended by being called historical, that's usually my line for the question. I'll add a part two while people are still thinking, but can anyone think of one historical figure that was trans, non-binary, or gender diverse? I really love asking these two questions in my workshops. I'm not going to lie. I ask those two in every session I do, no matter the group or the age or what we're coming into, because
Hi, Mariah.
Yeah.
Was Joan of Arc a lesbian?
I am going to bring up Joan of Arc, so give me 2 seconds, but excellent. So yeah, I love asking these two questions because, for one, the reaction's almost always the same, whether it be online or in person. There's usually a bit of a look of panic when I first ask the question, it's some glancing around and usually a little bit of silence because nobody wants to kind of guess and be wrong. And then when I ask the follow-up around trans, non-binary, gender diverse people, somehow the silence gets louder. Usually when I ask that one, which is I think it's really important to go through. And I do see, oh, I see Alan Turing in the chat, which is great because that's one of my favorite examples. Because a lot of the time, yeah, we draw these blanks or we can't think of anyone off the top of our head. And there's a little bit of there's a little bit of panic, but we do have a lot of folks in history from the queer plus and trans plus community who have made lots of impact. And I will acknowledge, certainly in the past, there was a larger need to hide and protect yourself. But there's certainly still a large number of folks who were fully out and fully open in who they were, making these waves and changes. I saw Harvey Milk thrown in the chat. That's a great example of someone who was fully open in that leadership kind of position, putting themselves out there at a dangerous time. Alan Turing is one of my favorite examples to use for this question. Alan Turing, who helped crack the Enigma code to defeat the Nazis during the World War, and then went back to England and was so persecuted specifically for being gay that he ended up killing himself. And I know for me, like thinking back to when I was in school and how many times they taught us about the world wars over and over again, and they never taught that story. And what a lesson that is in, losing such a talent and such a person who can contribute to society. For thinking of trans, non-binary, gender diverse folks, I think it's important to certainly acknowledge like trans women of color like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnston, who helped initiate the Stonewall riots in the States to help really fight for queer plus and trans plus civil rights. I think this is the section where I do think of Joan of Arc, because while I don't know about Joan of Arc's sexuality, certainly she was someone who dressed unlike a woman, acted unlike a woman, and was persecuted for that reason. So we have these folks in history and examples of leaders and stories that sometimes we don't tell. And it's hard for folks in the community, if you're not hearing about people like you making differences, to then turn around and see yourself making those waves and making those differences in your own community. I think just an important point to acknowledge, even thinking of leadership we have in our own circles and places and role models with folks. It's just really, really important that we think about those stories and we tell those stories. And again, another place where you can give yourself that challenge to take that little bit more learning. Take 10 or 15 minutes to Google some stories about people in history. Take some time in an evening to watch the Enigma Code with Benedict Cumberbatch. That's a fun way to learn some more about some of these stories. And I think important to give ourselves those different kind of options. And I see my time is very close to being out, but I want to take 2 more minutes before I open it up to some questions, if anyone has any, just to go over a couple quick language pieces and quick tips and tricks for folks to have. I'm going to send this diagram to you folks as well, but it's just a really nice way to put some of these concepts together that we've been talking about in terms of these different aspects that make up a human. Because I think a lot of the time when we talk about gender and sexuality, we're talking about the queer plus and the trans plus community, but it's important to remember that we all have a gender and a sexuality. And looking at this diagram, we have our gender identity at the top. So our inside concept of ourselves, our gender expression, that's how we take that inside concept of ourselves and put it on the outside. The clothes we wear, the haircut we have, what other people can see. We have our sex assigned at birth. Again, that's that biological component, your hormones, chromosome levels, your physical anatomy. And then your attractions, your physical and emotional attraction. But again, we all have those aspects of being human, and could all take a few minutes to sit down and really look at the diagram and kind of pinpoint where we see ourselves at each point. And even with some of us who maybe share identities or labels, I'd be willing to bet money I don't have that there'd be a lot of different gender unicorns even among those. And important that, again, we're expanding our minds, even when people are trying to maybe explain or share pieces of themselves with labels, that we're not closing them in. We're just taking the information they're actually giving and not filling in some of the blanks ourselves. Perfect. And this is the last kind of thing I think we'll have time for today. Sorry, which is probably going to make more sense because the part that's more about pronouns is a lot different in French. So thinking about the interpretation, it's a bit of a different beast thinking about gendered language and how that works. English is very different, and that is a limitation in some of our workshop work we do. That being said, I will shout out if anyone does have questions around more the French language side of things. Alter Acadie is a great organization that does really great work similar to Chroma in that space. So a last tool I want to add to your toolkit that I mentioned a little bit before, but I think is important to just expand on quickly, is just another kind of way to address kind of the community as a whole. I use the terms queer plus and trans plus a lot. Because they're two really big umbrella terms. Again, queer meaning just not straight or not cisgendered. And again, remembering our trans umbrella and how much that really encompassed. So it's really trying to acknowledge all the different identities that can fit within those labels. And the other thing that plus sign is trying to acknowledge is the intersectionality that exists within the community. And that's to say the different identities that exist even within a person that overlap and affect how they move throughout the world. So things like sexuality and gender, but also disability, religion, economic status, those things that you really can't peel apart from a person and treat them in an equitable kind of way. And my really simple kind of example that I use for this is even thinking about someone who is maybe queer and disabled. If you peel those two identities kind of separate from each other and just maybe send them to services, thinking through their queer lens, maybe it's not an accessible service or place. And if you're just thinking about them as a disabled individual, maybe it's not a place that's safe for them in terms of their sexuality or identity. So important that when we are looking at an individual, and again, treating them as the best expert of themselves, making sure we're really listening to all those pieces that make them up and not just parts of it. And that is where we're going to end that little bit of an information dump on